If the record. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the OpenEd 21 virtual conference. I hope you are having a good day so far. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. And if you've joined us yesterday, welcome back. And this is our second day of our plenary keynote. Today is really special because we have 2-for-1 keynote. We have back-to-back keynotes from no other than Kathleen Fitzpatrick and Leslie Chan. So just a little bit of housekeeping here, because there's a lot of us in this room. I request that if you have questions, please put it in the chat, because we might not be able to catch it if you put it in the, not in the chat, in the Q&A. Please put it there because we might not be able to catch it in the chat. And we'll make sure that you have plenty of time to ask questions to Kathleen and Leslie later. But first, I have the honor to introduce our amazing speaker. I'm so happy that one of my colleagues at Michigan State University is here with us. Kathleen Fitzpatrick is Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State University. At MSU, Kathleen directs a research and development unit called MESH, which focuses on building open infrastructure for the future of scholarly communication. She's also a project director of Humanities Commons. It's an open access, open source network serving 28,000 scholars and practitioners across the humanities and around the world. Prior to her stint at MSU, she served as Associate Executive Director and Director of Scholarly Communication at the Modern Language Association, where she was the Managing Editor of PMLA and other MLA publications, including overseeing the development of MLA Handbook. And Kathleen is author of many books, and her latest is Generous Thinking. I actually have, excuse me, a copy of that. And Kathleen, I think you signed it. Generous Thinking, a radical approach to saving the university. Please buy this book. It's really nice. So anyways, Leslie Chan is Associate Professor in the Department of Global Development Studies at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and the Director of Knowledge Equity Lab. Leslie's teaching and professional interest centers on the geopolitics of knowledge, production, and circulation, with a focus on how networking technologies are enabling new forms of open collaboration, critical pedagogical practices, while also amplifying and reproducing embedded power relations and inequality in the academy and beyond. As the original signatory of the Budapest Open Access Initiative, a historical and defining event of the global open access movement, Leslie has been active in the experimentation and implementation of scholarly communication initiatives of varying scales around the world. He also founded in 1993 BioLine International, which is a nonprofit scholarly publishing cooperative which seeks to share OA journals published in developing countries. So without further ado, let me present to you our back-to-back keynotes. We are going to start off with Leslie, followed by Kathleen, and then we'll have Q&A later. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Regina. You can hear me? I just shared out the link to my slide deck. First of all, thank you to the organizer, Nicole and her team for putting this event together. I see the program is just packed with very, very interesting talks and peoples that I wish I could go to every one of them, but it's just simply impossible. So it's very happy to be here. But Regina, you're infectious, so I'm so glad finally to be able to be in kind of the same place with you. Thanks for the introductions, and I'm particularly delighted to be in the same 2-for-1 session with Kathleen, longtime colleagues, and I'm a big fan of her work, and so happy to be a warm-up act for the second part of this presentation. So let me see if I can share my screen at the same time. Good. Okay. So I have a working title, When Open Education Collide with Closed Infrastructure. And it is a unfinished title. So at the end of the talk, maybe you'll help me finish what the title, the rest of the title should be. So hopefully it will make some sense. As Regina mentioned, I teach at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. And what I wanted to do today is really do more of a personal reflection, if you will, about my experience dealing with infrastructures. And I was speaking to Kathleen yesterday. I said, this is in a way talking about my frustrations with some of the barriers that I've encountered over the years as a person who wants to teach differently and wants to practice scholarship differently. So there are some personal stories, and I hope you would put up with me. And hopefully these personal stories will also resonate with some of you, and when we can compare notes after. So I teach at this campus, University of Toronto Scarborough, and this is a picture of this campus. It was brand new in 1964. It's opened up to accept its first student in 64. And for those of you who may not know University of Toronto, and sorry, I forgot to show a map to this international audience. We're located in Toronto, and this campus is in the very east end of Toronto. And it was one of the two so-called satellite campus that was opened up in the 60s by the University of Toronto. So the main campus, University of Toronto, is right downtown, right in the thick of downtown Toronto. And they opened up this so-called satellite or suburban campus in the 60s in the East End. And then on the West End, there's also another campus called Mississauga. You see this little futuristic building here, and some of you might have seen this building in various movies. There's over 50 movies been made on this campus, mostly dystopian science fiction type movie. Not surprisingly, this building looked rather futuristic, and it was built in one of those concrete brutalistic styles of the 60s. But what was also interesting about this campus was that it was designed from the start as a television campus. And so the idea was that this campus, being a new campus, was to take in the rapid enrollment growth in undergraduate students in the early 60s and in the 70s, and the anticipated enrollment in the 70s. And the province was willing to invest in this experiment in terms of a television campus that would take a lot of the overflow, if you will, from the main campus, but also to serve a different part of the city. And so it has television built into its original infrastructural design. And let's also remember, this is the time when there was a lot of excitement about this thing called television, and particularly also about this idea of the satellite. And it's not coincident that the campus is called a satellite campus. There is a reference to these kind of relationship of also the periphery to the center and so forth, and the connectivity through electronic signals. But of course, in the early 60s, there was a lot of excitement about this satellite potential to connect the world. And Marshall McLuhan dubbed the term the global village to describe the kind of new world we're entering with these electronic, with this television technology that could be instantaneously connecting people around the world. My colleague, John Lee, a sociologist, wrote a book about this experiment. And I remember Professor Lee had always talked about our campus having smart classroom but dumb teachers. Now, of course, he wasn't talking about us in particular, but he was really making fun of the notion of the smart classroom, which was really a term coined at this time, is to have classroom equipped with equipments that could bring in people, content, and other kind of interactive devices. As I mentioned, this was to a large extent, a way this experiment was to address this enrollment growth that is coming and the growing demand for higher education degree. Now, at the time, there was a total investment of over $2 million for building the television facilities at the campus itself. Now, $2 million in the early 60s is quite a lot of money by that time's term and by today's term. The point I want to underscore is that there was a lot of willingness to invest in infrastructures because this television technology was seen as this new educational labor-saving device. So there was some calculation that it will help faculty to save faculty's time, or cut down faculty's demand by 30% and save $1 million a year. The faculty or teachers will have to work 3 times as much to prepare for a television lecture. But the calculation is that then you can kind of coast within the next 2 years, so they'll all work out to be the same, and teachers don't have to work as hard, right? I think we've heard that story before. And their projected cost was going to be covered by an enrollment of 2,500 in the 5-year period, but that target was not met. So there are a lot of interesting context to this experiment, and I'll go through some of them. But the point I want to underscore is the willingness to invest in this crash program, quick fix for this impending enrollment, but also the idea of covering for shortages for faculties. Now, this is also an interesting thing compared to today. Today, of course, to get a faculty position is exceedingly difficult. You might as well jump off a plane, you have a better chance of surviving. But back in the 60s, a lot of the faculty were hired literally on the telephone. I remember, I should also mention that I actually studied as an undergrad on this campus in the 70s and early 80s as an undergrad. And many of my professors were literally hired off the plane on the telephone and so forth. So you need a job, you got a job. Come, when can you start? And that was really a big demand for faculty at the time. Now, of course, if you look at today's demand, is much more difficult, as I said, for someone who wants to get hired on as a faculty member. And I will come back to that point later on. Now, I want to show you some of the historical photos about the cost of this over $2 million of investment. They built everything from scratch, bought all the equipment. They have a TV, they have created a complete TV studio and editing rooms, bring in technicians and everything. And of course, wiring the whole campuses for closed circuit TV. So the whole campus was built with a lot of different places for big cables and so forth. Now, of course, it turned out for 20 years later down the road when all these TV were obsolete, those spaces for those big cable turned out to be perfect for fitting in the new fiber optics. So not surprising, our campus was one of the earliest campus to have really high-tech internet connectivity because of this legacy technology, ironically. So there were some pictures of instructors learning how to make instructional video for chemistry and biology. And the idea is that student could then go to their labs and watch this video in a different time of the day or for different classes. They also recorded some talking heads, English professors speaking to another, and then recorded these, and then student can then watch them. They also encourage students to create their own content. And on the right-hand side was what I call the original YouTube, but it is closed circuit, TV. Everything was closed circuit, but it was not equipped for real electronic satellite signal. But the idea was that they were able to produce their own program to supplement the 30% shortage. But in the end, as I noted, they were not able to meet the enrollment target. Now, my research shows that they have made quite a number of hours of videos, students watch it, but right now only 20 hours of those videos survive and is at the University of Toronto Library Archive, these big wheels of tapes. I watched some of them. They were not particularly interesting, but of course the technology is obsolete completely. You can't play those tapes today, but it's of its historical interest. So that was in the 60s and the 70s with this closed circuit TV. That didn't work. In the end, they had to go to face-to-face classes. The television experiment did not take off. Let's put it this way. Now I want to fast forward to the early 2000s. So I finished my undergraduate career. I was in graduate school, and I got a position with this unit called the Center for Instructional Technology Development, which was started by a rather visionary colleague of mine called William Barrick. He was really seeing a lot of potential with electronic text and with this new thing called the World Wide Web. And I follow him around. He's showing me all these interesting things that you can do with the web on your own. He teach me how to write HTML and all kinds of things that you could do yourself. And we became very fascinated with the potential of the web for scholarly communications, what later known as open access to journals and to books. We experimented with different forms of publishing, encouraging other colleagues to do so. And we created this unit, which William has always called the kitchen. It's the place where faculties can drop in and say, hey, I want to take these music and put it into my course, in my opera course in medieval or medieval history. I want these type of graphics into my course and so forth. And the professor in history created an entire history textbook on the history of the Russian Revolution, so forth. And we did a lot of experiment, but of course that was a little bit short-lived because when the next administration come in, they felt that we were too expensive and we were too niche. We only support a very small number of faculties who want to experiment. We weren't serving the increasingly large number of faculties and the growing population of the campus. So we were shut down. And luckily, a lot of those earlier artifacts were able to put in the university's repository. So if you're interested in looking at these artifacts, some of them I thought were still quite wonderful. Some early, this is a PhD thesis that shows some early potentials of linked data. And we have this very interesting study of e-text and potential of e-text early in the early 2000s. Now I want to jump forward again. So now into the present and the future. So earlier you saw that the original building was out on this left-hand side. That's the original building at UT Scarborough. And these are the projection over the next 10 years or so. A lot of these buildings already happened, but this campus is still growing at a rapid pace. So when I was there as an undergrad, there were 700, well, there was about 1,000 students. Now there are close to 12,000 students, and they're going to get way more as we go forward. And so obviously there are lots of big changes. Enrollment changes and a lot of student body in terms of diversity and in terms of faculty diversity as well. Of course, we're seeing a lot of buildings being put up, but most importantly, we're seeing a complete change in the way education is being produced and delivered on campus, sometimes in very subtle way. And I think the technology have so much to do with it in this transformation. Many of us are looking at issues about datafications and digitization of student information on these different platforms that are increasingly center stage as infrastructure that keeps our university running, especially since we pivoted to online learning with the outbreak of the pandemic. But what we're also very concerned about is the many hidden costs of the new kind of connectivities and the new kinds of educational delivery model. I am also reminded of the teaching of Professor Ursula Franklin, and this is another personal side history that I think is important for me. I was lucky enough when I was a graduate student to attend some of the lecture by Professor Franklin. Some of you might know her book, several books, and one of the more well-known one called The Real World of Technology, based on a series of lectures she delivered for the CBC. You can find all these recordings and the book online. And Professor Franklin, as a scientist, an activist, for many, many years, advocated for critical studies of technology, among many other accomplishments and important contributions to make to university life. So one thing she always reminded us is that we have to think about technologies, underlying structures, and the particular modes of production, because they directly not only reflect, but shape the way we think and act with each other. As technologies are social practices, they're never politically neutral, and in fact, often political control and ideologies are embedded in the design of the technology. And Professor Franklin talked about really two broad types of technology, what she called holistic technology and prescriptive technology. And so when work is organized as sequences of separately executable steps, the control of the work moves to the organizers, the boss or manager. And in political terms, prescriptive technologies are designs for compliance. She went on to remind us that what we should not forget is that these prescriptive technologies are often exceedingly effective and efficient, but they come with an enormous social mortgage. The mortgage means that we live in a culture of compliance, that we are ever more conditioned to accept orthodox as normal, and to accept that there is only one way of doing the technology. And she also reminded us that if there were ever a holistic process, a process that cannot be divided into rigid predetermined steps, it is education. And holistic process are processes that allow the users of the technologies to be in control of the process from the beginning to the end, both in terms of the intention and the output, right? But increasingly, we have lost that ability to think about or to use technologies that are designed holistically. And so we are now in a world of a lot of hidden connectivities and invisible mediations. A lot of what we do are being mediated by actors that we don't know who they are, because they are behind the screen, and the screen is no longer closed captioned or closed closed circuits. The who's behind the screens are very, very distant and layered and hidden from us. I'm looking at this rendition of the future building that is coming up on our campus, and I was fascinated by the description of this rendition. They talk about the classroom being built with the campfire in the middle, and that there will be rooms for collaboration. This is collaboratorium that will allow for collaborative discourse and group work. Now, of course, as someone who worked on the campus for many years, this is exactly the kind of design we were asking the administration for years. Said, please do not bolt the seat down to the ground. We cannot create small group work if the seats are bolted down to the ground. But of course, we continue to have classroom with seats bolted to the ground. But more than that, we have platforms that are bolted to boxes that we can move or see into. And so here we are using Canvas. Many of the other learning management system is designed pretty much the same way, but our campus moved to Canvas from Blackboard about 4 years ago. And of course, we are now deep into the usage of these learning management systems that are completely outsourced to third parties that are owned, operated by private equity firms and other mysterious organizations. And so compared to when we used to invest money in our own infrastructure, to now outsourcing all the infrastructures, of course, we need to calculate lots of different things. But to me, this huge cost of losing our ability to be our own agents as teacher, to be in control of the learning and teaching process is a troubling one. And I want to give you an example of what Professor Franklin speak about as prescriptive technology. So I'm a big fan of this tools called Hypothesis. Many of you probably have used it too. It's a social annotation tool. I've used it for my courses over the years for small classes. You can just basically layer it on top of any website, web pages, and so forth. A great way to encourage students to read deeply and collaboratively. And so when I noticed that Hypothesis is actually integrated, can be integrated into a learning management system like Canvas, I asked our local administrators, so why don't we integrate that into our platform so that I can use it for my larger classes. The advantage of that, at least, is that I can have students log in through through their account and be able to use this together without having them to have different sign-on and so forth. So began my process of finding out how complicated it is to get a tool like Hypothesis integrated into the system, because there is supposedly this approval process that is very complicated. As you can see, it has to go through multiple layers of evaluation and approval before they can get implemented. And I was told that it would take a minimum of 2 years for my approval to be considered. So by then I'm, who knows, I might be retired. The point I'm trying to make here is that I have a pedagogical reason for wanting to use a specific tool, but we have a system that actually tells me I have to wait in line for it because there are administrative demands that take priority over my interests in engaging with the student. So at the same time, I found out that when I go into the existing setup of the Canvas, I can now access either this Turnitin or Regional, this other plagiarism software. Now, what is even more of a joke is that Turnitin, well, my campus finished his contract with Turnitin, and they have signed a new contract with this company called Original. But as it turned out, Turnitin bought Original. So we're actually using the same company, but this company's tools is already integrated into the system when I'm not sure anybody actually asked for it. I certainly didn't. And so whose decision it is to include these tools is not often in our decision-making process. I share this screenshot again just to underscore how monopolistic these tools are and how increasingly we are just buying into the same vendors over and over again, whether we're talking about different parts of the learning management system or the whole of it. Many of you might have seen this diagram of the consolidation of learning management system over time. And of course, in the last year or so, Canvas is gaining even more usage around the world. But I want to draw your attention to the left-hand side of this diagram. And that is, you will notice that many of these platforms today have their origins in university that were originally supported by public system and investment. Desire to Learn and Well, for example, I myself, we have taken part in the early days of the Sakai Consortium, hoping that we could be part of the Sakai Consortium and get it implemented on our campus. But of course, at that time, we went to Blackboard instead because the administration think there was too much of an investment in building or supporting our own infrastructure. But I again, want to remind us a lot of the money that invested into these were public money to begin with. But we keep giving our lunch away and then having to pay back in much more different costly ways. Of course, consolidations continue unabated. Some, most recently, this other merger that is very troubling. And then, of course, in the space that I've been looking at, more so in scholarly communication, we're seeing also more and more consolidations with all kinds of very strong implications. This particular tweet by a librarian is, I think many share the same sentiment, is that we keep giving our infrastructures away and not investing in the way we want to do things as a community and as scholars. And so what are the alternatives? And I'm so glad this is why I'm in the same session with Kathleen. And this is not all doom and gloom, by the way. There are alternatives. And my students have been reminding me, say, Professor Chen, what are you so worried about? We have for their own exchanges. They set up this open practice forums and then be running their seminars and sharing their writings and learnings and so forth as a way to show that there are community infrastructures that we can look to different kinds of scholarships and learning approaches. So I'm finished here. And so if you don't mind, or if you have the inclination, I'd like to see if you can help me finish my subtitle. So here's the link. When open education collide with closed infrastructure, I will turn to humanities commons. That would be my takeaway for today. And so I will now turn it over to Kathleen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leslie. I am really, as always, delighted to get to be in conversation with you as we work on similar problems from slightly different perspectives. I am going to go ahead and share my slides and make sure that they come up okay. Are you now seeing my slides? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. I want to start quickly by thanking Regina my wonderful colleague here at MSU, for inviting me to talk with you. And I also want to thank Nicole Allen and the rest of the Open Ed team for the extraordinary amount of work that's required in organizing an event like this. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share it with Leslie and to get to talk just a bit about a few issues that have been worrying me with respect to the present course of higher education in general, as well as what my colleagues and I have been trying to do about it. You'll see that I cover some of the same terrain that Leslie did in his talk, but from a slightly different perspective, sort of backing out to look at some of the political and economic backdrop in which these changes are happening, and then zooming in to look at a particular potential path out. So all of this starts, unfortunately, with economics and the lock that it has on contemporary ideas about the public good. So in June 2021, an independent economic group released a report indicating that the University of Michigan, Michigan State University, and Wayne State University together boosted the state economy by $19.3 billion in 2019. And a figure that they went on to note is more than 20 times the funding that's provided to them by the state. It's an extraordinary report, and it confirms the thing that we all know, right? That public research universities are crucial contributors to the economic well-being of their communities. And our universities not only conduct the research and development that leads to new business opportunities in the state, but they also build the educated workforce that's ready to take on the challenges that our communities face now and into the future. This is great news, and it's particularly great to have numbers like these that can be used in arguments about the value of public investment in institutions of higher education, especially at a moment when relationships between legislatures and boards of trustees and universities are increasingly strained. But I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about why reports like this one make me nervous. It may sound weird, but frankly, it's because they do too good a job of tying the public vision of the value of the university to its economic impact. And in the process, they inadvertently run the risk of undermining the purpose of the university as a broad service to the public, rather than as an engine of economic growth, right? And so they end up turning attention away from the ways that investments in the non-money making parts of the university ultimately pay off in the public good. In other words, the danger of a report like this one, as positive as its results are, is that it speaks to a particular mindset in particularly American culture, but a mindset that's becoming predominant in lots of other places as well. A mindset that's primed to hear it, right? With the result that it completely overshadows all of the good that the university does in areas other than the economic. And that focus on economic impact may be fine in good times, right? When taxpayers and legislators feel like they can afford to invest in a broad range of kinds of exploration and education on campus. But in bad times, when budgets are tight and jobs are scarce, many begin to look at those kinds of exploration that don't have obvious or direct economic benefits as luxuries, right? As frivolous, as extraneous to the institution's mission, precisely because the institution's mission and the public good that it serves have come to be wholly tied to ideas about economic growth. So there is, in other words, this deeply ingrained mindset that lends itself to the assumption that economic development, both at the social level and at the individual level, is the primary good that the university can and should serve. And this is a mindset that I would love to see us work on changing. It has its underpinnings in our faith in the extraordinary creative potential unleashed by capitalism, but it leads to the assumption that all of the problems in the contemporary world can and should be approached through market-based solutions. This tight focus on the market as the telos of contemporary life is often discussed under the umbrella of neoliberalism on campus. Neoliberalism is admittedly one of those terms that's been so relentlessly misunderstood and misused that it's become a kind of caricature, right? It's an empty critique now with all of the force that bourgeois had in the mid-1970s. But it's the kind of term that causes a lot of people to stop listening, right? Because we know what's coming is both profoundly ideological and likely not to mean exactly what its speaker thinks it means. But it's nonetheless an important concept and one that can tell us a lot about what's happened within Western culture since the early 1980s. Right? The forces that have encouraged the public to question the value of institutions of higher education, as well as the other forms of public investment in the public good. I mean, in fact, neoliberalism is part of what surfaced the question of whether there can be such a thing as the public good in the first place. Just as Margaret Thatcher argued in the 1980s that there was no such thing as society, but instead only individuals and families that needed to look out for themselves. So today we find a predominant political perspective, particularly in the US, that holds that all goods are and should be private rather than public, right? Individual rather than social. And the effects of this conviction on our culture today have been corrosive. We've experienced over the last 4 decades a dramatic increase in inequality, both economic and social, as those who already have benefit from an environment in which rewards accrue to the individuals who are already most equipped to pursue them. We've also seen a radical decline in our cultural sense of shared obligations to, or even basic care and respect for others. Broadly speaking, we've lost our collective grip on the notions that our individual actions affect others, that we should act with those others in mind, that we share common concerns, and that we're collectively responsible for ensuring that we provide a viable future for all of us. And without those understandings, without a recognition that the global crises that we face today require responsible social engagement and collective action, poverty will continue to increase, structural racism will continue to grow, and the very prospect of a livable planet is thrown into question. So, I want to pause here and acknowledge that I've managed to get in a very few minutes from a highly encouraging report on the economic impact of public research universities to the question of whether the future will be a livable one. And there are several links along the way that I haven't fully explored, not to mention all kinds of alternative paths that we have to consider. So I want to backtrack a bit. If, as I'm arguing here, our overdetermined focus on the economic good that universities provide has the potential to undermine the other kinds of goods that our institutions serve. I mean, what are those other goods? How are they undermined? And what do we lose if we lose them? How might we begin to ensure that they remain a crucial part of the public vision of what the university is for? So in order to explore the university's purpose in serving the public good and the ways that the neoliberal understanding of the university's function have weakened it almost beyond recognition, we might begin by thinking through the distinctions drawn in economics among the 4 primary types of goods, right, and the ways that they are defined. First, through their excludability. Right, or whether non-paying customers can be prevented from using them, and second, through their rivalrousness, or whether their use uses them up. Right, so public goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, meaning that no one can be excluded from using them and no one's use uses them up for others. Private goods are typically both excludable and rivalrous, right, and are typically market-based as a result. Goods that are non-excludable but rivalrous are thought of as common pool resources. And these were the goods that were assumed for a long time to be subject to the tragedy of the commons until the work of Elinor Ostrom demonstrated the potential for shared governance in ensuring their sustainability. And I will be coming back to that in a little bit. But finally, club goods. Right? These are those that are excludable but non-rivalrous, right? Goods that are not diminished through use, but that people can be prevented from using unless they pay for them. The question is, what kind of good higher education and the knowledge that it provides and creates are and should be, right? Knowledge is certainly non-rivalrous. If I have it and I share it with you, I don't wind up with less of it as a result. Right? The question lies in excludability, where once knowledge and the higher education that it fosters might have been seen as striving to be non-excludable, right? Making itself available to anyone desiring it. Since the 1960s, it's become increasingly excludable, right? Restricted to those who can pay. Access to knowledge is today a club good, in other words, rather than the public good that was once imagined to best serve our society, right? Supported by all for the benefit of all. Now, our social ideals regarding private education have always been flawed, even at their most promising moments. Right? Our system of land grant universities was founded on the appropriation of land from indigenous nations, and the GI Bill supported rather than undermining racial inequities. But the underlying principle remains important, right? The understanding that the university's purpose is the broad education of the public. And that broad education has always been understood to have benefits beyond the directly economic, creating a world that's not just more prosperous, but better in a much deeper sense. So in order to focus on that better, we need collectively to rethink the systems through which we produce and share knowledge, both with one another, with our students, and with the world. Ensuring that we keep our focus on the larger project of collective understanding that's at the heart of the academic mission. And this mission requires us to find ways to treat knowledge not as a club good, right, restricted to those of us who are on the inside, but as a public good, right, created for all, available to all. And this, as Tressie McMillan Cottom reminds us in lower ed, is not a problem for technological innovation or a market product. This requires politics. The university's present situation, after all, has its roots not just in economics, but in politics, right? The institutions that not too long ago aspired to serve as a highly accessible engine of social mobility, making a rich liberal arts-based education broadly available, today face not just a drastic reduction in their affordability, but an increasing threat to their very public orientation in the first place, right? As rampant privatization not only shifts the burden of paying for higher education from the state to individual students and families, but it also turns the work of the institution from the creation of a shared social good, right, that broadly educated public, to instead focus on the production of market-oriented individual benefits. And many of our students are just as embedded in this privileging of individual benefit as is the rest of our culture. I mean, our students have been told repeatedly that the purpose of a college degree is developing the skill set that will lead directly to a lucrative career. And given how much they and their families are paying and indeed going into debt for that degree, it's understandable that they feel that way. Preparing our students to enter the workforce is not a bad thing, right? And I'm not at all arguing that we should just simply wave that aside. But if the goal of the university should be producing graduates who are not just successful economic actors, but who are well-rounded humans, right? Who are able to think creatively about the complex conditions in which we live today, and who are willing to contribute not just materially, but socially, ethically, even morally to the improvement of the world around them, not just for themselves, but for others. If that's the goal, then we need to transform our engagements with students in order to show them a different path. And this is where generous thinking comes in. We need to find ways to use our collective knowledge for the public good, demonstrating our deep connections to and indeed our responsibility for the world around us. The university's educational mission is and should be cultivating that generous thinking, preparing our students not just for the professions that might lead to wealth production, but for the various pursuits that life offers. I mean, we're educating the leaders of tomorrow, not just in the conventionally understood political and business realms, but in the kinds of engagement that will help their communities grow from the grassroots up. And that mission demands that we focus on what is required to make a better world, right? Both on campus and off. It requires that we rethink our institutions' often unspoken structural biases, including that toward economic impact. It requires us to focus not just on making it possible for more kinds of people to achieve conventionally coded forms of success, but on examining what constitutes success, how it's measured, and why. And all of that requires a values-first approach to higher education and an ongoing examination of the ways that these values are instantiated in institutional structures and processes. So, if we understood the well-being of communities to lie not just in the individual economic prosperity that can result, but in terms of individuals' ability to work together, right? And to engage in collective action toward a wide range of common goals, we might begin thinking about how the university might itself begin to rely on systems that support connection and collaboration. We might think about the infrastructure of teaching itself and how it might be used to help shape a more richly understood public good. I mean, as Leslie's talk demonstrates, we have become increasingly dependent on campus on a wide range of platforms that deliver our core services, right? So learning management systems, which he discussed, but also student information systems, publishing and communication systems, research information management systems. And by and large, all of those platforms are platforms over which we have very, very little control. Right? They're vendor owned, they're corporation controlled, and as such, they are far more responsible to their shareholders than they are to us or to our students. They appear to serve needs on campus that we cannot fill ourselves, and yet there's no sense of service in their relationship to our institutions, only extraction. Right? They take in our content, they take in our metrics, they take in our vast and growing annual fees, and they leave us dependent, privatized, beholden to economic forces that do not serve the public good. So this is just one of the reasons why my colleagues and I have been working to develop an open source, open access, nonprofit, academy-owned and governed alternative to such extractive corporate platforms. Humanities Commons instantiates several key principles. First, that higher education will benefit from all of us doing more of our work together in public, where the publics that we need to support our institutions can begin to see the significance of the work that we do. And second, that institutions of higher education must do everything they can to resist and reverse the privatization that's overtaken them, restoring service to the public good, not just to their mission statements, but to the heart of their actual missions. And part of that resisting privatization involves turning away from some of the externally developed and deployed systems, or as Leslie points out, even worse, the internally developed and then spun off into corporate entity systems on which we have become dependent. Instead, reserving our investments and our labor for systems and platforms and infrastructures whose missions genuinely align with our own, whose values mirror our own, and to whose governance we can contribute. And this is true of a wide range of systems and platforms on which higher education relies, but perhaps nowhere has it become more pressing than in thinking about educational technology. I mean, we, all of us, librarians, instructional technologists, instructors, administrators, all of us need collectively to turn our attention to developing the shared publicly oriented systems that we can count on to support us as we develop new modes of open knowledge sharing, right? Modes that might help higher education re-engage with the public good. But developing these collaborative, community-oriented forms of infrastructure, forms that can create the paradigm shift that we're going to need in order to change the direction of the future of higher education. All of this is going to require some careful thinking about the work that will be necessary to make these platforms sustainable. This is one of the issues that caused those platforms that were developed on university campuses to be spun off into corporate entities, is that, an individual campus can produce a thing, but sustaining that thing for a very long time is not something that we've been equipped to do, right? And this kind of sustainability that we need to be thinking of is not just financial sustainability or technical sustainability. I mean, those are the kinds of sustainability that we typically think of in terms of when we reflect on these kinds of platforms. But most importantly, I believe we really need to be thinking about social sustainability, right? Or a deep focus on the relationships that are required to build and maintain our shared infrastructure. Thinking about these relationships under the rubric of social sustainability directs our attention not just to the determination of a group of people to support a particular project, but rather to their commitment to this concept that they are a group, that they're working together in the first place. Right? Collective action requires a kind of solidarity, in other words, a readiness to put the needs of the whole in front of local demands, a determination to stand together in support of projects that may not necessarily seem to be our own personal top priority. And this form of solidarity, I'm increasingly convinced, is a necessary prerequisite for successful, sustainable development of nonprofit, open source, community-owned networks and platforms. Now, the connection between sustainability and solidarity brings us back to the work of Elinor Ostrom, who focused on common pool resource management. She argued fiercely against that conventional wisdom that the so-called tragedy of the commons was inevitability, that what made it inevitable was what's been called the free rider problem, right? Which derives from the assumption that when individuals can't be prevented from using commonly held resources, but they also can't be compelled to contribute to their upkeep, some number of individuals will avail themselves of the resources without supporting them. And as the number of free riders grows, the resources become prone to overuse and eventually become unsustainable. Or so the conventional wisdom had it. The only means imagined to help prevent the tragedy of the commons before Ostrom was external regulation, whether through privatization or nationalization of the resources involved. Ostrom, however, studied a wide range of community-held fisheries and demonstrated through them that community-based systems and structures for ensuring those resources' sustainability were possible, provided the right modes of self-organization and self-governance were in place. Relationships, in other words. I mean, there are lots of potential examples of free and open digital scholarly platforms and projects that are seeking to provide community-based solutions that avoid the pitfalls of privatization, but all of them face a common problem, right? There is often sufficient support available for building and implementing such systems, but there aren't funding programs designed to ensure that they can be maintained. And as a result, the tools and platforms often accrue technical debt that becomes increasingly difficult to manage, rapidly making the projects appear unsustainable and thus leaving them in danger of real obsolescence. So some argue that the best means of ensuring the sustainability of projects like these is economic, right? Eliminate the free rider problem by enclosing the commons, requiring individuals or institutions to pay to use them. But this privatization is often the very problem that the community-developed projects were developed in order to solve. So like with Ostrom's fishing communities, it's incumbent on us to find the right modes of self-organization and self-governance that can keep our projects open and thriving. Building open platforms and keeping them functioning is not something that any of our institutions can do it alone. You look back at the narratives of all of those learning management systems, and the issue is that they start on a campus, they take in a few other collaborators, and then it becomes difficult to sustain without the kinds of relationship building that we really need to do. I mean, so this is something that we must do together and at scale, right? We can build and we can share and we can maintain the infrastructure that will allow all of us to genuinely open education, and to make the knowledge that we develop for and with our students a public good. I've got a lot more to say, about what would be required for us to commit to that work, especially about the challenges involved in shifting the relationships between our institutions from the competitive to the collective. But making those changes, if we can do it, will enable the university and the public good that it serves to become the infrastructure that allows us to build a better world. So at Humanities Commons, we've been working to develop a model that will encourage organizations and institutions to invest in a shared network, to support it in an ongoing way, to recognize that not only do they belong to the collective, but that the collective belongs to them and that its future depends on them, right? And making that case requires not just a flexible technology or a working revenue model, but far more importantly, a compelling governance model, one that gives all of us a voice in the network's future and a stake in its outcomes. As Eleanor Ostrom's work demonstrates, building the community that supports a platform like Humanities Commons and enabling that community to become self-governing are crucial preconditions for its success. This is true for a wide range of open source Academy-owned infrastructure projects, which require collective action for real sustainability. And it's at the heart of open education, right? Your institutions, of course, have very different structures, very different requirements, very different needs, and yet you share the same goals, right? The development, distribution, and preservation of new forms of knowledge. And that you're all here together, looking for ways to meet your shared goals, despite your different local needs, gives me hope. It's a key form of generosity, one that can help us escape the bottom line orientation of the neoliberal university to embrace instead the wide range of public goods that the university should serve. But if we're going to reclaim our public mission and to reclaim control of the work that's produced in and by the university, we're going to have to do so together, right? Acting not just in solidarity with, but with generosity toward one another, toward our students, toward the other institutions to which we are inevitably connected, and toward the public that we all jointly serve. If we're going to develop and sustain the kinds of community-supported infrastructure that can enable open education, we have to genuinely become and act as a community. So I'm honored to have had the chance to talk with you this afternoon as you continue the work of building that community. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kathleen and Leslie, for this thought-provoking, provocations that you presented to us. There's really a lot of things to digest in this talk that you've shared with us. And as you were talking, I can't help but think about reassessing the power relations in our knowledge infrastructure. You speak about education and knowledge as a public good, but we are now moving towards making it like private. So I'm thinking about the role of governance in this knowledge infrastructure. Who really benefits and who is left behind? And again, this has material consequences, right? Because this requires investment. How do we ensure, as you mentioned, Kathleen, in your talk, that this shared infrastructure, so, I am talking broadly about open and the resources that we are producing. How are we making sure that this shared infrastructure resources is socially sustainable and does not perpetuate, again, the infrastructure divide between institutions that have and those institutions who don't have?
Yeah, I mean, that's
thoughts about it.
Such an important question, Regina. And I think there are two things that I would want to point to. One of which is, I think we have to create an environment in which institutions that have feel a responsibility for supporting the institutions around them that don't, right? So we should see much more investment on the part of well-funded, both public and private institutions in technologies that then are used to bring in institutions, our regional public universities, community colleges, and more that don't have the resources to invest in these projects. So we need to really be thinking collectively across those ranges of universities to make sure that everybody is able to participate in these projects. But the second thing is we also need to be really careful as the university is creating new projects and investing in new projects, that the university has a voice in the charter of those projects, that we're able to make sure that, like Humanities Commons has written into its charter, that we will always be nonprofit and that we will never be sold into corporate hands, right? So, and that's something that I think it's really crucial for us to make sure that we can insist upon in the platforms that we're working with. Too often right now, our universities are developing projects and understanding them to be on some level for profit, because at some point they will be spun off into companies, right? And that's the thing that keeps getting us into trouble, because we create these wonderful projects, we send them out into the world, and then they turn around and charge us in ways that aren't sustainable. So anyway, I'm going on at length. I can stop. Oh, Leslie, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. I think is this mindset that I think set in place, pitting against institutions against each other. I think this notion of competition in this sort of free market society, and that institution have to demonstrate the success over the other, is what drive these kind of all institutions on their own kind of mentality, right? And I hear that all the time, but he's not part of us, so why are we helping them? Literally from administrators, right? And so this is where will get us into trouble. And the reality is, as you said, collectively, we have a lot of brain power and wealth, right? We put together we can put together a lot of resources, but these resources are not evenly distributed, as Kathleen mentioned. The top get more and more of it, and those in different rung get less and less of it. We allow the system to perpetuate itself, this type of the hierarchy and uneven distribution. There is no reason why it needs to continue that way, right? And that require different kind of thinking, as Kathleen said, is a thinking about collective, about enough for everybody. It's not a zero-sum game. Don't worry, just because you help other doesn't mean that somehow you're going to be deprived. In fact, you're going to be better off by working collectively. I think that's the kind of mindset we don't get, and then we don't do that in the classroom, right? Students are afraid. So if I want to get an A, so I'm not going to help somebody to get an A because that would diminish my A somehow. We somehow use that mentality across all our system. And so I think we need to get our head out of that space and say, well, we can all get an A, why not? If we have each other, if we deserve an A, everybody gets an A.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's why, it gets to the heart of generous thinking, right? Like generous, like what we are in this community. We freely share, our knowledge. And it's like, quoting from your books, emphasizing listening, right? Over speaking, community over individualism, and collaboration over competition. Speaks to what you are saying, Leslie, about, the dynamics of some of the things happening in the classroom. Let's take a look at some questions from our participants. And Maya asks, could either both of you speak more about the usefulness of seizing the means of production or reviving the commons without it itself turning into a prescriptive or formulaic or a kind of like a best practice directive? Are there fail-safes that we can build in along the way to actually develop collectivities or shift the paradigm meaningfully? So yeah, that's a lot to answer in the short time that we have, but like, just share your thoughts.
Well, I can share just a little bit, which is that the deep background of Humanities Commons lies in, the first piece that we built was MLA Commons. And MLA Commons was modeled off of the CUNY Academic Commons at the City University of New York. It was developed at the Graduate Center, and it was developed in part as a means of developing a space for open communication among the faculty and graduate students on all of the CUNY campuses, right? Of, whom there are thousands upon thousands spread out all over the city. There had previously been no way for them really to share work together, to share syllabi, to come together and think about some of the common issues that they were facing. And in part, the CUNY Academic Commons was developed as a sort of skunkworks alternative to the learning management system, because I had several colleagues who were teaching in the CUNY system who were, I don't remember if they were using Blackboard or what they were using at the time, but who really, really were not happy with that system and who wanted to be able to offer their students something as simple as a WordPress blog, as a means to engage with the technology that they felt was going to be most productive and most useful for their students to learn about. And so as a result, that process of taking the technology that is open source technology and making it available in another form led to a complete transformation in the networking systems of an enormous university. And so I think there are other stories like that as well, but ways that a commitment to open technologies on campus can really shift where the center of gravity in a university's deployment of its platforms lies.
And Leslie, I am interested if you got some responses with your unfinished sentence, when open education collide with closed infrastructure.
Yeah, actually, I forgot to look. Somebody says student pays more and power returns to people, or yeah. Anyway, I don't know if particularly, maybe I didn't ask the question properly, but I think there are different, it seems like there are different reactions to some of the things that I said earlier. I think even, I just looked at some Twitter reactions. That some people think that, maybe our critique of the system may be one-sided, and that maybe there are certain benefit to the other, to how the system now offering to some people, right? But again, I think that might be the case in terms of offering some possibility. But the point I think both Kathleen and I are really talking about is governance and ownerships of these infrastructures. Like, the decision-making process has been opaque in how these systems are set up, and their logic and the design logic are not in alignment with us as researchers and as teachers, right? And so if the logic is to drive efficiencies and maximum number of student enrollments and so forth, that may not align with why we want to engage in a certain ways, right? So why wouldn't our engagement, the means by which we want to teach and learn, be the primary consideration over the notion of efficiencies and speed? I mean, I'm always laugh at this speed grader in Canvas, because that's the selling feature, right? How fast can you get through these grading to get to the next class, right? It's not how much student learn. It's like, do I know if the student actually learned anything because he got an 80 versus a 60, right? And so our tools are not in alignment with the pedagogy. That's really the point. And so how can we have input into how our tools should be built and how we want to use it from beginning to end, as Professor Franklin said? How can we make it generative and holistic? We just don't have enough space for doing that. We're so busy doing all these other bureaucratic things, filling boxes and so forth, instead of putting our head together as collective and say, how can we help each other move along and support each other? And I think that's the other point too, right, Kathleen is making, is that as faculty member, we too are also isolated. Right? These kind of venues, great to know how many of you out there are working on common issues and so forth. But on a day-to-day basis, most of us are pretty much, isolated in terms of how we're going to work and operate. And then with these online things, even more so, right? And so you're put into boxes all the time. And so how do you build communities that are supportive of each other, that are generative for each other? That really is the key. So that learning management system is not designed for community building. They're designed for pushing numbers through. And that's really the point.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have like a follow-up question to that, but I wanted to address some of the questions here in the Q&A first. Anonymous attendee said, what advice do you have when a librarian asks their administration who owns the content on our Blackboard instance? Who owns the content on our Blackboard instance? And they look at you like you have 3 heads.
The question of intellectual property in university instruction is an enormous one. And unfortunately, it varies widely based on employment type, right? At least in my experience, at many institutions, tenure stream faculty own the intellectual property that they create while at the university, where contract instructors and staff may not own their intellectual property. It may be considered work for hire, and the university may consider itself to hire that work. So it's determined by contract with those faculty. On top of that, there's the problem of the contract with Blackboard. Right. So taking a look at what that contract says in terms of, does Blackboard have any rights over the material that's been placed into its platform? Does Blackboard assume that the university is the owner of all the content? I mean, are there terms in those contracts that are worth digging into? I don't know. I've never seen such a contract. So I would want to take a look at what those contracts stipulate about ownership of that content.
Yeah, and we have another question here. When we say, I think this is yours, Jeff, when we say that we're not more privatized or more exclusive or focused on economics now than in a period of history in our higher education, where would you look in history as an aspirational goal? If there isn't a great place to look, how can we all talk about the issues of exclusion via money and platform, while taking into account the different but still exclusive mechanisms of power that kept marginalized groups out of higher education?
So, Jeff, these are great questions, and I'm not sure I have a fully satisfying answer to it, because I'm not sure there is a fully satisfying answer. I mean, as you point out, even at our most sort of glowing idealized moments in the history of higher education, there have been great inequities that have underwritten the kinds of openness that have been provided. But the couple of examples that I would point to as being places to look for alternative models within the mainstream of higher education, I would look at the golden age in the Wisconsin idea. right? At the moment at which it became clear to a progressive governor and a progressive university president that if they worked together, the university could be not just like funded by the state, but in fact fully part of the state and could be part of education for all of the people of the state in a very, very broad sense. And a lot of the programs that grew out of the Wisconsin idea and a lot of, I mean, the kinds of commitments that haven't yet been undone by terrible governors and terrible chancellors of the University of Wisconsin still hang on. There's a lot of good public service in that institution, in that state, that I think should get more attention. On the other hand, there are also alternative forms of higher education that have developed at various points in time. And I would look in particular at some of the local institutions that arose during the civil rights movement, in particular, from the 50s through the late 60s, that were really focused on providing education to community organizers of a kind that they requested, right? That were really focused on folk education. And I think that there is some serious work to be done. I would look at Miles Horton and the Highland School, Highlander is a TV series. That's not the one. You know what I mean. Anyway, Miles Horton, MYLES, look him up. But there are great alternative forms of education that I think that we in classically organized higher education today could bear to learn a lot from. Highlander Folk School, I was correct. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, so Elizabeth Rodriguez asked, so we were talking about governance earlier, right? And how do we ensure that, you know, the shared infrastructure is socially sustainable? She asked, how much power has been taken away from shared governance structure in universities? Do you have any ideas about what we should do to take that power back? Yeah, looking for some hope amidst this hopelessness.
Yeah, I wish I have answer for that, because I'm looking again at my own institution. When I started there a few decades ago, I would say there were a lot of public debates about day-to-day issues and governance and, you know, curriculums, student welfare, and so forth. Increasingly, these decisions are now predetermined, you know, and we just get informed at the end of the process, and a lot of these things are taken place behind closed door. And then you look at governing board, you know, half the people in the governing boards are from the private sectors, or more of them are from the private sectors, and so they are informing the university's directions. And as Kathleen's pointed out, you know, many universities are sites of profit extraction, and they have credit rating for all the university, and our rate higher than the province itself. So if you want to invest, you know, people put their money into some institution because it you know, generates income. And so the more it generates income, the more they're addicted to that income. And so the more opaque they become in terms of governance. So it boils down to, again, to that ideology. So what is the purpose of the public university? And, you know, if the public university is there to serve the citizens and the public goods, then we really need to completely rethink this governance from the ground up, right? Are we too far into this? I would say for some university, but you know, there's no reason why other university couldn't begin anew. I'll give you a great example. A few years ago, I was invited to a small port in Brazil, Port Seguro, not so small, but a colleague who was teaching at the University of Sao Paulo, was a provost there, decided to jumpstart a federal university there to serve the communities, to provide education to the underserved and so forth. And he mobilized a whole bunch of his colleagues, who were teaching at the University of Sao Paulo and other big university to move to this rural university to start up this university, right? And it was great. I was just on a short visit there, and the students were so excited. Some of them are farmers, some of them are young people, never been to school before. And just the diversity and the excitement of learning, it was just palpable, right? And I think it takes commitment, it takes determinations, but it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm only going to add one short thing to that. This is the point at which I step beyond my kind of somewhat encoded talk about neoliberalism into saying organize. Organize, organize, organize. One of the things that we as faculty, as staff, need to do on our campuses, if we are going to take back shared governance, is to organize, to come together with a single voice, to have solidarity with one another. It is not accidental that our campuses have as many different hiring categories as they do, because it keeps us in boxes. We've got infinite hierarchies of privileges on campus, and it keeps us fighting for our own privileges rather than working together to lift everybody up. On my own campus, pretty much everybody on campus is unionized, except, of course, the upper administration and the tenure stream faculty. Everybody else on campus is represented in some fashion. But because the tenure stream faculty are not, we can be used as a weapon against the unions in various kinds of contract negotiations. So when COVID comes around, we are informed that the tenure stream faculty are taking a pay cut, and then the unions are told, well, you have to give us this much because the tenure stream faculty are giving us this much, right? So it creates this conflict on campus that can only, I think, finally be resolved by organizing together all of our categories of employment with one voice, saying to the administration what it is that we insist upon in terms of governance on our campuses. It is not easy. It is a painful process. There are a lot of people who disagree with me. But I think that it is the only path that we have toward changing that situation that Leslie is describing, in which boards of trustees no longer have any compulsion to listen to what's happening on campus. There are a lot more of us than there are of them.
Oh my, in that note, I want to thank you, Kathleen and Leslie, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. So many things to think about, but I am filled with so much hope. I'm really filled with so much hope, because what we do impacts our students, the communities around us. Yes, we might be this small community, but I really believe that we start small and then have that, extend outward, so that, there's gonna be more of us. I don't know when that will happen, but it's a start, right? And so I know that there's so much promise, there's so much good that will come out, from the work that we do in the open. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you who attended this plenary, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, Regina. And
thank you,
Kathleen. Always great in conversation.
Great to see you, Leslie.
Yeah, same.
Thanks a lot,
All
Regina.
those questions. Sorry we couldn't answer them all, but
I know.
if you want to reach us separately, we're happy to do that. Thank you
Yes.
for all the
Excellent.
questions. Yeah.
Please